Good afternoon. Welcome to the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, ARCUS, where Arctic research has connected since 1988. My name is Bob Rich, and I'm the Executive Director, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our 17th Arctic Research Seminar Series presentation here in Washington, D.C., where we're delighted to welcome Peter Pulsipher. ARCUS works to connect Arctic research across boundaries through communication, coordination, and collaboration, providing the essential intangible infrastructure that's required for research to advance. We're a not-for-profit consortium of organizations and individuals that are working together in support of inquiry, discovery, and understanding of this important region and informing sound decision-making. This seminar series is designed to provide unique access to some of the leading Arctic researchers and leaders for federal officials, members of the DC policy community, and broader public interested in the changing Arctic. The ideas shared here represent the cutting edge of what we're learning and exploring up north, and also what it means for the U.S. and the rest of the world. For those of you in the room here, I encourage you to take a look at the ARCUS materials outside on the table about the services and membership that we have. And afterwards, I'd be happy to discuss any questions that you have, or would love to hear how we can best help you to succeed in your interests and research related to the Arctic. If you're online, you can access the information at the conclusion of the seminar under the Documents tab, and my colleagues are available online who can answer any questions that you have. If you are in the room, you should have received a seminar evaluation. These are very important. Please do fill them out before you leave so that we can learn how the speaker went, but more importantly, how we can plan to have even better and more useful presentations in the future. We are always planning upcoming seminars and need your suggestions to select the best possible speakers. Online, you can fill out the survey at the conclusion of the webinar, and you'll be able to tell us who you think ought to be the future speakers. For those of you on Twitter, we encourage you to use the hashtag, and you can see it on the screen here, hashtag ArcusWebinar to discuss the event. Now, we're currently joined by more than 90 registered participants from throughout the U.S. in at least 9 states, and in Canada, Iceland, Greenland, Sweden, Germany, and probably other countries as well. For those of you online, you have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the seminar. You can type your questions into the attendee control panel in the comments box, and we will get to them at the conclusion of Peter's presentation. Whether you're here or online, I invite you all to become a member of ARCUS. Currently, all types of organizations are eligible to become ARCUS members, including academic institutions, government agencies, corporations, and indigenous organizations. Also, any individual can become a ARCUS member if you share our enthusiasm about the importance of Arctic research. You can join at www.arcus.org. I'd like to acknowledge our partners in this seminar series, the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which enables us to use this excellent meeting space. Thank you also to the Polar Research Board of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine for their assistance with registration. Of course, I want to thank the National Science Foundation Division of Polar Programs for major financial support to ARCUS and to this seminar series. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Pulsipher. Peter brings together the research communities of data sharing, Arctic information, and community engagement with local observations and traditional knowledge. As a skilled leader and facilitator, he chairs the Arctic Data Committee of the International Arctic Science Committee and the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks program. He also co-chairs the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, or IARPC, Arctic Data Subteam. His Aloka project has achieved widespread visibility and acclaim for enabling local observations and traditional knowledge to be organized and used for community and global benefit. Peter is based at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and he splits his time between Boulder, Colorado, and Ottawa, Canada. Peter holds a PhD in geography from Carleton University. Please join me in welcoming to the ARCUS DC Arctic Research Seminar Series Dr. Peter Pulsipher to tell us about Arctic observations, data and society, using system science and mediation to enhance information flow for sustainability.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to all of you who are here with us in person or online. Just make sure my microphone is on here. So Bob has already read the title for you. So I'm going to talk to you today about data and information, sustainability, and a number of other interrelated concepts. So I'll be talking specifically around Arctic observations, data, and their linkage to society, and how thinking about information as part of an interconnected system may help us to enhance information flow, which is something that we're all talking about and I think moving towards, but perhaps not quite there yet. Additionally, I'm going to touch on how the mediation or transformation of data will play an increasingly important role as we move to a system that crosses community boundaries. This will not be a talk that focuses on the bits and bytes of the data or the technology per se, but it will focus more on how we think about data and how we can improve information flow in support of sustainability and other societal priorities. If you do have more technical questions, feel free to ask them at the end of the talk, and I'll do my best to answer them or connect you with somebody who can. Some of you online and a couple of you here in person, I think, will have seen some of this talk. I'm building on a talk that I've given over the last few months in some national and international venues, but I'm going to be updating it on some activities that have happened over the last couple of months in particular, and that have implications for some of our work and activities over the coming months and years. So just a quick overview of the presentation. So I'm going to give some high-level context about observations, data, and society to start. Go into a little bit about what the vision is, the collective vision that we're seeing form within the national and international community over decades. Look at the system as we're seeing it at multiple scales at present. And then talking a little bit about what we may be able to do to try and guide the system and sort of push it in directions that we may want to see it go. And then towards the end, I'll provide a bit of a review about some existing and emerging community mediators, as I will talk about in the presentation. So just for very high-level context, many of you may notice that data is really big right now. There's all kinds of discussions about big data, its implications in society, what it means for us, the opportunities, the challenges, the threats, etc. When we talk about big data, we're talking about data that is typically very high volume, it's high velocity, it's moving very quickly, it's got a lot of variety, and it also, veracity is a part of that, is the trust and the ability to actually know the data. There are definitely opportunities for it. There are also challenges around data, and increasingly, and particularly recently, based on changes in administration, etc., there are now discussions about perceived threats around preservation of the data, access to the data, and that sort of thing. And that's not only here in the US, but I think worldwide. We're seeing that. We've seen it in Canada, where I live, and we see it in other countries as well. So there are all kinds of different conversations going on around data. We're seeing everything from the appointment of a chief data scientist under the last administration here in the US, to the establishment of a number of global data fora for discussions of research data, to concerns about the security of the data, as I mentioned. When we start thinking about observations, data, and the Arctic, it's a bit of a different scene. There's a lot of that conversation going on about data. These discussions are related to an envisioned sort of Arctic, integrated Arctic and sustained Arctic observing system. And from my purposes, I tend to think about the observing and the data as two sides of the same coin. They're very interrelated. We talk about them separately often, but really when you're thinking about it, the observations, whether those are observations by a sensor or by a human being, we're then thinking about how do we actually capture those, how do we have them persist over time in the form of data. But the situation, I think, in the Arctic is a bit more nuanced than the sort of broader context that I talked about in the last slide. In the broader context is big data. The data being collected is often collected in as part of our everyday lives, whether that's using a cell phone, whether that's driving through a toll booth, whether it's filing your taxes, etc. data are being collected whether you're aware of it or not, and it's actually being collected typically in digital form so that it can be used for all kinds of different purposes. When you're thinking about the Arctic and thinking about things like environmental data or even health data for that matter, you're going beyond this idea of having it automated. And so often these data need to be collected very, very deliberately and at great cost. So observing the observations themselves and the ensuing data management are challenging at times, and they can be quite costly. So increasingly, this cost must be discussed and justified in terms of societal benefit, beyond the historical driver, which was, fundamental understanding of the Arctic system. So often, in decades and centuries past, it was more of a frontier kind of mentality, a scientific mentality. Okay, we just need to understand this really important but remote area of the world. We're now looking at it saying, okay, when we're talking about funding, how does that fit with national priorities and so on? And also recognizing that it is in the Arctic, in the case of the Arctic, it's home to people who have lived there for millennia. So it's not terra incognita. It's actually the homeland of many indigenous peoples. And so we need to think about all of those things. So there's been some really interesting work done on this in very, very recently. In January of this year, the Science and Technology Policy Institute, based here in this region, convened a workshop. They partnered with the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks program to look at basically societal benefit areas and the societal framework for the societal benefits that we see from observing. And you'll see here from the little starburst there, there's a lot in the way of potential societal benefits from observing, and as an extension from the data that are collected from those observations. So that report was just released, I think, a couple of months ago, and more recently, the country of Finland has taken over as the chair of the Arctic Council, and they have announced their intention to take this idea of the framework and bring it forward more specifically and to look at some of the details within the 2 years of their chairmanship. So that's a project that has been proposed and is starting to get some traction as well. If you look at the report and you think about a lot of the discussions or look at the discussions happening around this, sustainability is a key concept. So we are looking at things like economic viability and so on. We're looking at things like benefits, health benefits and so on, but there's also a lot of discussion around the idea of sustainability. So how can we use this for the betterment of society with a sustainable sort of long-term approach? So recognizing the term sustainability is one of those very difficult to define terms and sort of vague, but it is there as a core to our discussions around observations and data for the Arctic. So if we drill down a little bit more and start thinking about Arctic data specifically, a lot has been done in this area. A lot has been done particularly in the last 10 years since the beginning of the International Polar Year, which started 10 years ago this year. There have been meetings, there have been sessions within conferences, there have been reports commissioned and so on, and much has happened in terms of identifying what the requirements are, identifying the sort of vision for the data system, the challenges, and so on. And just to summarize, one thing that you see again and again in these reports, meetings, and so on is a common access or single window to the data through information technology. So the ability for people to actually say, okay, where can I find the data but not have to go to 15 different interfaces and so on. So that's probably the single largest one that you see, or the single most common that we see. High quality, ethically open data preserved over time. So there's a lot of discussion around those ideas, and that fits with this idea of sustainability. So how do we make it persistent? Data as a service, so moving away from sort of the download model of data to one where you can hit the data in real time over the internet and be able to use it in your particular environment as a service rather than as a download that you set up on your local machine. Interoperability, which is this idea of how do we share data between and among systems and in a useful and meaningful manner, so not just connecting, but being able to actually have different systems and people using those systems understand the data. A system that is inclusive, indigenous, and local perspectives, as well as the information, knowledge, data, and so on generated by those communities. And that's an area that I've done some work in, but many others are doing work in that area as well. And then access to big data and powerful analytical tools. So this is more emergent. This is happening over, I'd say, the last few years. It's become particularly popular, this idea of cloud-based computing, idea of virtual research environments, and so on and so forth. So all of this has been sort of, discussed and is an ongoing discussion. It's actually a very active discussion that I would say is changing probably monthly at least, if not weekly sometimes. And I'll touch on some of the more recent developments in the field later in the presentation. So because of the sort of activity and the velocity and the change that's happening, how dynamic it is, I think we need to start thinking about this system in a way that's probably different than we have been. I think in the past we've thought more about it as just a collection of data centers, a collection of data objects that then somehow need to be sort of organized and just made available in a fairly straightforward way. And I think that is still there, but we're seeing an increasingly large array of different types of systems emerge, different data resources, whether those be data sets, whether those be data applications, and so on. They have typically in the past been discipline-based, but that I see changing as well because we're starting to see more and more interdisciplinary work going on and work that involves researchers, people in communities, decision makers, and so on. But in all cases, data management and just the whole sort of data world is becoming more and more prominent and more of a priority, both in terms of the value that's being established, but also the funding that's becoming available for it. So here I'm just going to talk a little briefly about the complexity that is involved and why I think we need to take a systems approach to conceptualizing the data system and to looking at how we actually move towards achieving the vision. So when we're thinking about the Arctic, we're often thinking about different scales, so from local right up to international. We're thinking about different temporal scale. So from the distant past, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago to possibly thousands of years ahead, or at least decades and centuries ahead. This is the space-time dimension. So that's an important dimension of the data that we're working with. We also have increasingly a range from what I'll call the narrow to the holistic and the conceptual dimension, which is we have very discipline-specific or community-specific interests where there's a focus on one particular phenomena, right through to interdisciplinary where we're looking at all kinds of different topics and themes together as a whole. And then we also have what I'll call the collaborative dimension. This model relates to a project that I'm working on called Pan-Arctic Options, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we have individual, a grad student, for example, looking at a particular question, right through to multidisciplinary, multi-participant kind of research. And so if we start plotting, we can find ourselves having different types of projects represented here by PRJ. So this project up here would be one that you might think of as a big science project that you would have seen in the International Polar Year. Highly international, highly interdisciplinary, and looking at everything from local right up to international scale. And so in that case, you have usually many people, many different disciplines, and so on. And you have to think about data management and data representation in those terms. You could also have something that, somewhere in the middle, it's more national scope. It has different researchers, but maybe not as many as some of these larger projects, and so on. You can go right down into an individual who's looking at one particular phenomena in one particular location, by themselves, and that's it at the local scale. And then so on and so forth. So you can plot this out, but really the vision isn't just to say, okay, let's have all those data exist independent of each other. We're talking about trying to get those data to flow. And so that is our challenge, is how do we get the flow to happen through these different scales, not only spatio-temporal scale, but also conceptual scale and the scales of collaboration. And I'll touch on this later, but the scale of collaboration, I think, is a particularly important one when we're thinking about flow. So to try to make some sense of this, a group of us are taking a look at what kind of models that we can put on top of this view of the system to better understand it and better sort of inform how we move forward. One approach to that is looking at it as a data ecosystem. And the data ecosystem you can sort of use as a metaphor, or depending on how the research goes, we might actually see it as a way of predicting, or again, using it in more than just a metaphor. I don't know if we have a pointer here, but you'll see if you look at the system, you have producers, you have consumers, you have different services that are available throughout the system. You have decomposers, all kinds of different cycles running and so on. What we're starting to see is this idea of keystone species, or sort of larger hubs that actually have a large impact on the system if they change or if they disappear, and so on and so forth. There's definitely a scale dimension that looks at processes at the micro scale right up through the macro scale. So I'm not going to go into all the details of this. We're preparing a book chapter that should be published early next year as our first work in this. But the important thing is there are different aspects of the system theory that I think are very, very relevant to the type of things that we're trying to do in the Arctic data world. So one part of this is if you look at network system science, which is part of the overall systems thinking and also relates to ecosystems thinking. But if you look at the network system science, you can say that understanding networks tells us a little bit about their design and about what needs to happen for networks to be functional, what needs to happen for them to be robust, and so on. So what you typically need is multiple hubs that are connecting to less connected nodes through the idea of loose ties and a hub and spoke sort of scale-free network. So again, I don't have time here to go into all of the details, but what it's saying is if you really want to have a good, robust network that's going to survive over time, it's not just the full sort of peer-to-peer small nodes that are connecting, nor is it one big central hub that is going to do it for you. What it's going to be is a mix of all of those interconnected and highly connected together. So this distributed multi-scale system is what we have, and it's really what we want because it does have some benefits. And some key benefits are things like responsiveness, resilience, diversity. So it just keeps the diversity in there, moves away from sort of a monopoly idea. It avoids catastrophic failure. So the idea is that, okay, if you have a nice central approach, that could be cheaper and seem more efficient. But if that node fails, and this is something that we're seeing, again, around the world right now, what if that particular national node fails as a contributor to the global system? Causes a huge problem. If you have it distributed, you have these large hubs that are interconnected and working together, it's a much more resilient network. So in our work, we're starting out the mapping this ecosystem and trying to actually look at it and say, okay, what's in the system and how does it work? And at the base, we're talking about different species, I'll call them, or nodes in the system. So one is cyber infrastructures, and these are infrastructures that do one of these things, whether they're talking about data or information acquisition, storage, management and curation, integration, mining, visualization, and so on. So we're trying to identify those organizations that do these sorts of things. And we're also looking very closely at these mediator organizations or nodes. And these organizations are organizations that coordinate and drive collaboration to bring about understanding, agreement, and a desired result. And as I'll go through some of the sort of initial results, you'll see that there are many of these different organizations in place, and they're increasingly starting to work together. So they're really an important part of the system. So under a Belmont Forum project called Pan-Arctic Options, led by Professor Paul Berkman, and has 6 different countries involved in it, we have just recently hired an Arctic data ecosystem scientist named Dr. Katja Kontar. And so we're very pleased to have Katja join our team as of a couple of months ago. She's going to be taking on some of this work and be taking a leadership role in this work. As a starting point, she'll be looking at the Arctic Council corpus, or the body of reports and so on that have been generated through the Arctic Council over the last 20 years, and sort of tracing those back to the different information, data resources, et cetera, that were used to generate those reports. At the moment, she's in the process of scoping that because it's a very large corpus, so we're trying to figure out, are there particular reports and so on that are particularly important. And then we're going to use a number of different methods to sort of map out the resources and so on. I'll be working with her, as will Dr. Berkman and others, on some of the modeling techniques and as well as sharing the results with the community. So stay tuned there. As I said, we'll have our first book chapter coming out that's just going to be more of an overview early next year, and then a series of publications and other types of dissemination on that work. So now I'll just take you down a little bit into what the system currently looks like. I don't expect, or this is not a comprehensive view of the system. It's definitely an ongoing project. We don't know everything that's out there, but what we're trying to do is sort of go through that process, do some modeling, and also do the documentation as we go. So if you look at it at a fairly high level, it's a fairly simple model. You can sort of organize it in many different ways. In this particular view, I've organized it by groups that are looking at both polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctic. There are many institutions that do that, these sort of mediator organizations. Those that are just looking at the Arctic, and then those that are global scale initiatives that happen to have an Arctic component. And so you can see, you might recognize some of the different organizations, World Climate Change Research Program, the United Nations, Future Earth, and so on and so forth. Global Ocean Observing System at the international level. I haven't drilled down into the others, but I'll show you in a moment that as you drill down, it starts to get fairly complicated. There are many organizations. If you go into any given country or any different organization, international organization, they often have subcomponents and so on. And so we're doing that. And if you look at a group like IARPC, with the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee in the US, it has its own ecosystem. So it has, I believe it's 14 different agencies and some other connected bodies and so on. And if you look at any one of those agencies, they're going to have their own data resources, mechanisms, organizations, et cetera, within their own agencies, whether that be NASA, NOAA, EPA, and so on and so forth. So this is under discussion at the moment, how we might do this at a national level as well, and some initial work has been done at a workshop in March at IARPC to start that process, and we're in conversations now on how to take that forward. But it's clear that to really understand it, it's going to take some effort at multiple scales. And sorry, I'm just going to bring it here. If you look as well, and I'll talk a bit more in detail about this field, but look at community-based activities, community-based monitoring, and so on, you'll also find it has its own ecosystem. So there are a group of organizations, research labs, and so on and so forth, individual communities that are doing lots of interesting work in this area. And as you get into it, you realize that it's not just a small collection of a few people doing work in that area. So I'll take you on a bit of a whirlwind tour here. I'm just mindful of time of some of these different infrastructures and organizations at different scales. So specifically, if we look at the global scale, we have a number of different organizations that are global initiatives, like the World Meteorological Organization, but have a fundamental interest in the Arctic and usually have a very specific program and so on. So I won't go through all of the acronyms, but it's clear that they're playing a large role, and I'll talk a little bit about some meetings that happened just recently. But they're playing a large role in what's happening in the Arctic, and I think they'll play an increasingly large role in Arctic data. We also then, if you look just specifically at those that are looking at the polar regions, or particularly at the Arctic, we have the Arctic Data Committee that was mentioned earlier that I chair with IAS-SEAON, the Antarctic folks, Global Cryosphere Watch, the GeoCold Regions Initiative, and so on and so on and so on. So all these are different organizations that are in some way looking at coordinating or bringing together different parts of the Arctic data system. We also then have national infrastructures. So this is just a sample of a few national and a regional, one being the European Union or European Commission. So we have a lot happening in the US, as I sort of alluded to IARPC, but there are other groups as well that go beyond that. Canada is in a similar situation where they have federal departments, they have territorial and provincial elements, they have local, they have research, and so on and so on and so on. At the local level, which is the area that I do most of my work in, we actually have a surprising, well, not surprisingly actually, given the population that's there and the interest that they have in it, we have a lot going on. So there are many, many different projects that are happening that are some cases happening right at the community level, where individual communities are developing their own data infrastructure, their own collection methods, etc. One community I'm working with on Baffin Island is doing that from scratch. They received their own funding, wrote the proposals, and are building everything from the ground up. In other cases, you have sort of international efforts that are looking at coordination and bringing together different initiatives and so on. So we have a lot happening there, and this ranges everything from looking at documenting Indigenous knowledge and maybe heritage preservation, right through to community-based monitoring of environmental parameters, health parameters, and so on. One example through the project that I lead called Aloka, and my co-leader Colleen Strawhacker is not here with us. She may be online, but we've been doing work for about the last 12 years under Aloka in partnership with communities or with researchers who are working with communities. This is one example where a group out of University of Alaska Fairbanks, led by Hayo Aiken, has been working for about 10 years with communities in the North Slope, Alaska, and other parts of Alaska at collecting local observations, and everything from atmospheric to sea ice to health to just the activities that are going on and so on and so forth. So I think we probably have around 6,000 observations or more than that in the system now. And what we're seeing is we're doing a bit of a development push over the next 6 months to a year on it. So we're going to be expanding the mapping components of this and looking at apps and all kinds of other things, looking at connection to other initiatives that are doing this type of thing. But what has happened most recently is we have expanded to work with communities in Greenland. And so we've established what's called PASUNA-Net. PASUNA is the name of the observing system, the observing network that they had already established. And they were looking at data infrastructure and how they could sort of expand into that area. So when they saw the SeismoNet application, they said, wow, could we have one of these? So we worked with them and we obtained some data from them, worked with them to try and do the translations and so on. That's now operational. It's at a prototype stage, but we're actually starting to test it. And we're looking not only at having their sort of system running in Greenland, but we're in active collaboration with the SeismoNet folks to actually look at sharing across those communities in Alaska and in Greenland as well. So this type of thing is happening, and it's an important part of this overall data ecosystem. And I think it's actually a critically important part because the people involved in it are people who have been in the Arctic for a long, long time, have the experience, have the knowledge, and who are living in the environment. And so their observations are much more persistent than often the scientific observations, at least the in situ, can be. At the higher level, we have initiatives like this led by Inuit Circumpolar Council in partnership with Aloka and a number of other organizations where we're trying to say, okay, what is happening at a global level? So you have initiatives like SeismoNet, like PASUNA-Net, like the LEO network in Alaska and so on. And so what we did was ICC and others got together and said, let's start mapping this out. And so we put together an online interactive tool that allows you to go in, and that's now being expanded through the Antaros program out of the European Commission and so on. So again, this seems like the local type activity, and it is local activity, but it has global implications and a global footprint. When you're working with communities and Indigenous knowledge, you also have to think about there's more than just the data involved. There is a context, and there is a movement right now for communities to be able to take more ownership of the data that's collected about them, that the data is being collected by them, and so on. And so if you think about this idea of information sovereignty, the sovereignty is the authority of a state to govern itself. Information sovereignty is the authority of a people to govern their information. And so there's a lot of context in history that matters in this case. And so some people say, well, why should it be any different than anything else? And I won't go into all the details here, but we can talk about it either in questions or after the session. But there are many reasons why it's different. There's a new research coordination network that has just been funded under the National Science Foundation, led by Colleen Strawhacker, but in partnership with a number of Indigenous organizations in Alaska and the US Southwest, and some observers as well, or partners in Canada. And we're going to be spending 4 years sort of looking at this idea. So what does this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty mean? What are the implications for communities? What are the connections that we can be making to the science and research community as well? So there'll be some really exciting things, I think, coming out of those discussions over the next few years, and it will be a very inclusive and collaborative approach. So when we start thinking about guiding the system, we more and more have a better understanding, I think, of what the system is, what it looks like. I mean, that's going to be a big job to really complete that. But there are certain things that I think we can think about in terms of guiding the system. And so what can we do to promote this vision that I put up in one of the earlier slides? It's going to allow us to do all these wonderful things, have the single window, the interoperability, inclusive of all kinds of different perspectives, et cetera. And I would argue there are a few things that we can do that are quite important. One is infrastructure thinking. So if we want to get to a point where we can actually have a persistent system, a robust system, et cetera, we have to think about parts of the system being infrastructure. And so my friend and colleague Mark Parsons says, you know, data is available as electricity. So not the data that appears and then disappears 3 years later when the lab, you know, project is lacking funding and so on, but something that is there over time. Seeing it as foundational, so there has to be a curation component to make sure that it survives over time and it actually continues to be useful over time. What's important here is that when we're trying to think about, you know, how to fund this and how to make this happen, not all parts of the data lifecycle are infrastructure. So there are ways that we can prioritize and say, okay, the infrastructure is sort of the foundation to everything. So that needs to be prioritized in making sure the infrastructure is there, and then other parts of the system can be funded in a more opportunistic or sort of different, diverse kind of ways. But without the foundation there, you know, all of the other levels will not be very functional. And I'll show a slide in a moment that'll sort of depict that. Sustainability is foundational as a concept to infrastructure. So this is where it really comes in, not to the type of sustainability you think about in terms of ecosystems and so on, but it is a key to the whole effort. Interoperability. So I talked about this earlier. So this is the ability to share data and functions across different information systems in a useful and meaningful manner. If we're going to go beyond these individual silos that are useful maybe to one group or another group, but not to you know, the population as a whole or different end users, we need to have some level of interoperability. The good news is we have all kinds of different standards and so on in place that can really facilitate this type of thing. There are still some challenges, particularly around semantics and vocabularies. You know, how do we actually share the meaning that's embedded within the data? There's some good work going on there and some hopeful results that we're starting to see there, but there's still some effort to do there. But this is, again, you know, above the infrastructure, this is quite fundamental if we want to have this connected, integrated system, which is what is part of the vision. So mediation is what I think of as a key to making this all happen. It's one thing to have the infrastructure there, to actually have the data there in a repository, to have it, you know, available either as a service or a download. It's another to say, okay, well, we can share it, we can integrate it, but then what? We've really been talking not only just having the data available, but making use of the data for different applications and for societal benefit. So to do that, we need to think about how do we actually work with data, how do we transform it for different purposes and so on. So this is an important element. I think an important layer within the system is this mediators layer, which is going to embed different types of applications and so on. It needs infrastructure, so you can't just say, oh, let's go and fund and promote the mediator level, because it needs to build on an infrastructure of data. But it also allows you to start thinking about a lot of different applications and creative ways of using the data and reusing the data, more importantly. It's one thing to use the data, you know, the original data collector, to say, okay, I can reuse my data, you know, 5 years from now and rerun an analysis. Is another for somebody else in the community to use it for either their own analysis or for a purpose that nobody ever thought they'd use it for. So this is just a sort of a high-level kind of architecture diagram, but you'll see that the vision here is to be able to take all these data and use them for all kinds of different purposes and people, you know, whether they be communities, researchers, funders, et cetera. And to do that, as I said, we need our infrastructure, but we need this level in the middle that's going to be able to take what's in the infrastructure and repurpose it for the different end users. And that's where I think we can be creative as well on the resourcing side, because you don't necessarily need to fund all of the mediators all at once or with the same group. You could sort of distribute that globally into different types of tools that can be developed, and spread around. The infrastructure is a little bit more, I wouldn't say centralized, but you have to do a little bit more targeted and long-term funding and that type of thing. But I think this gives us a really good shot at doing it in a way that can work. So one thing that's come up a lot, particularly in the last couple of months, as I've sort of done reading as well as traveled to conferences and so on, is that we have all kinds of emerging technical mediators, particularly this idea of machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on. And I've been at meetings where people have sort of said, look, in a way, can't we just let the machines figure all this stuff out? And I think that's actually a valid or an interesting and potentially valid statement, that what we're doing now is probably not what we're going to be doing in 5 years' time because of the advances in machine learning and so on, particularly around how the data are documented and that type of thing. So there's a lot to learn from what's happening, and a lot is happening in that field. I won't go into the details, but there's a really great talk at the recent Research Data Alliance conference in Montreal a couple of weeks ago from a leader in the field who's published a book called Deep Learning, and so I'd suggest if you're interested to read that. It's a really good look at the things that are happening and the things that we can expect to see. And there's also some really good funded activities that are being done through various grants and that type of thing. And new infrastructure. So the screenshot here on the lower left is called the Polar Thematic Exploration Platform, or PolarTEP, which is basically a virtual research environment that the European Space Agency has funded. So suddenly you're bringing all kinds of data and code together, analytical capabilities, et cetera, that can be used in a really, I think, paradigm-shifting way. It's moving us from a situation of being able to having to download different pieces and put it together on your desktop, being able to go to the web and have everything there at your fingertips, or at least a lot more there at your fingertips. So, being mindful of time, I'm going to fairly quickly go through what's happening now within the broader community internationally as well as nationally. This is just a quote from a workshop that we had last year on interoperability, and I think there were about 60 people or so from all over the world there. And we all agreed that the bigger challenges right now are organizational and individual or personal rather than technical. So we have to figure out this sort of coordination aspects, the human aspects of interoperability to really move forward. So we're seeing that happen. We have a collaborative community that has been established and is actually increasingly working well together. We're increasingly coordinating. We have all kinds of connections that are already in place or being established through different organizations. So we have a whole bunch of them. I won't go through all of the details of each organization, but what we're seeing now, I think, which is even different than 10 years ago, where there was a lot of goodwill in International Polar Year and there's a lot of great work done, is it was really, really new. And now that hard work, I think, that happened there is really starting to sort of mature, and we're starting to see lots of good results in terms of moving forward. We are also looking not only at the Arctic and the Antarctic, but we're saying, look, let's not create our polar silo. We need to make sure that we're connecting to all kinds of other interesting work that's happening outside of our field. And so Research Data Alliance is one that I mentioned, and I think is a really good example of where we're making connections as well. So I won't go all through the points here, but one of the bodies that is playing an important role, I think, in this is the Arctic Data Committee that was formed a few years ago. And so primarily right now we're looking at coordination and facilitation, bringing together working groups, and also trying to do things like put together with our partners, things like the interoperability workshop, our recent meeting in Montreal about 2 weeks ago. So we're now starting to really get our legs, I think, and get more organized, as well as getting some funding in place for these types of activities. And so we'll see where that takes us. At the national level, those of you who are not familiar with the IARPC, Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, there's an environmental intelligence group there, and then under that, the Arctic Data Subteam. And really, again, that is just working to facilitate and bring together, most of the agencies and others who are doing the heavy lifting. And we're just trying to provide a sort of cross-agency platform there to enhance the dialogue and try and coordinate and bring different efforts together. All of this is part of a network, so there are things that are happening, I think, in isolation, but I don't think there are many major initiatives now that are happening without some connection to this broader international network. So if we're not working directly together, at least people tend to be aware of what's happening at the international level, and I think increasingly at the national and local level as well. This is just a photo of our meeting 16th to 18th of September in Montreal. It was held in conjunction with the Research Data Alliance 10th plenary. So we met for 3 days as a polar community, and then we went on for 2.5 days to engage with the global community at Research Data Alliance. We had a lot of really good conversations there and some good planning. We've got a working group now that's going to be looking at federated search at an international level. We have a semantics and vocabularies working group now that's being established. It's looking at those aspects globally. And then we also have, fortunately, some resources through the National Science Foundation to organize. For the moment, we're working on a possibly a different name, but a Polar Data Planning Summit, which will bring together, the idea there is to not have a conference as much as a work planning meeting that will bring together practitioners and funded initiatives, including the signing authorities who have the authority to actually make resources available, together around a particular case study. So the particular case study is under discussion. We've just agreed that this is a good idea. We have the resources for the workshop. We have some time and some staffing to do it. And we're now going to work together as a community to say, let's establish a case study. Let's make it something that can be done because we know we already have the resources. So we're starting with the resources that exist, not what people would like to write a proposal for. We're going to try and get together in May of 2018 so that we can have the initial results of this available for the Arctic 2018 meeting in Davos and possibly for the next Arctic Science Ministerial that will be late in 2018 as well. Our challenges right now are making sure that we can do a case study that's as inclusive as it can be but still be productive and focused, and then also to figure out the representation model, because the idea is not to have 200 people around the table trying to plan this, but to have a small enough number that we can really move forward. So each large organization like Global Cryosphere Watch for the meteorological organization is going to work with their community to try and focus it and bring a couple of representatives who will represent them. We're going to be looking at national representation and then also trying to work with Indigenous communities, for example, to have their representation. So stay tuned for that. We'll be working actually with ARCIS and a whole bunch of other groups to try and make sure that people are aware of what's happening there. And what we're really aiming for is to take it from that discussion of this is what needs to happen to this is what we're doing together. So with that, I will just conclude by saying I think that the important things that we need to think about moving forward is we need to situate the system. And by that, I mean we need to think about where it sits in the, not only in the world, within scale, that, yes, there are other international data things, but we need to situate it in terms of societal values and societal benefits, which has increasingly happened, but I think it has to be fundamental to our discussions, not only of the observing system, but the data system moving forward. We have to do some work to understand the system, because I think if we don't have a better understanding of the system, we're not going to be able to influence it and sort of direct it in the way that we want it to go. It's going to emerge and evolve at some level on its own, whether, however we want to design it, it's going to keep moving in some direction or other, but this way at least we can help influence it. We need to build on existing cyber infrastructures, and I highlight the term infrastructure there. So again, this infrastructure thinking, but then the idea that no single infrastructure can serve all those different communities or all those different end users. So we need to have that mediator layer above it and think about how we invest in that to make optimal use of the data that's stored in the infrastructure. And then connecting and sharing across different knowledge domains. And that is where, really the connecting and sharing is about the mediation, the transformation, and so on. And that, I think, is our big challenge, because that is where the human, the social side of it comes in, the organizational behavior, as well as trying to understand knowledge models and different worldviews and so on. So with that, I'll say thank you very much and acknowledge some funders and also some of the communities that we're all working together with, and then hand it back off to Bob.
So thank you very much, Peter. I love the big picture perspective on the Arctic data system. I think that's one of the hardest and most important things that needs to be done is to see the whole picture so that we can figure out how to effectively pull it together. We're open for questions. You can type your questions in the chat box online. You can also raise your hand in the room. Is there anybody who'd like to start with the first question? Yeah. Go ahead and press your button on. You figured that out. Yeah, press the button on the microphone to speak.
Thanks, Peter. So at what scale should mediation occur to transform data into usable information for users? Like, where should we focus on developing mediation capacity?
That's an interesting and difficult question. In the first work I did on this, I think in 2004, 2005, and some work that I did, I sort of point out that it happens and needs to happen at all scales. So it will happen, for example, at the community scale. If you're thinking about, how data are being used for community purposes, it will be mediated in a certain way. It will happen right up to the global scale. In terms of investment, I think one of the areas that we need to focus on is how do we invest in the regional and international scale? Because right now, if I'm a soft money researcher, which I am, and I think, wow, I want to develop some sort of mediation approach or technology, I can say, I'll go to this funding agency or that funding agency to make this work. And I can work either at the local communities as some of the work I do, or I can work with my national community and say, let's bring these together and develop it, test it, and so on. What we don't have right now is a really good mechanism to do that at a regional scale, i.e. multiple countries in a region, or internationally. We're really struggling because we have all these individual parts and infrastructures that are developing, but we don't have that mediation layer, and it's not clear where we're going to get that. So we're hobbling together, or we're sort of putting together little bits and pieces of this person's budget that they'll sort of wedge into here, and that person's budget that wedge into there. And we're starting to see some things like the Belmont Forum and other mechanisms, but that's where I think we need to pay some attention, because we're trying to get to that regional and global level, but we don't really have the mechanisms to make that happen.
Thank you. So I had a question that I love the image that you have of the Arctic data ecosystem, and I was a little surprised though when you included in there a box for decomposers. I'm wondering, are you sure you want to let the decomposers into your ecosystem?
Well, you'll also see that the decomposers, and I'll just see if I can quickly, I won't go back to the slide, it'll take me a while to get there, but the decomposers are really the mediators. The decomposers are what's taking, matter, energy, and so on, and using it together to create something new, and the decomposers tend to create something that's fundamental to the functioning of the ecosystem. So if you take those decomposers out of an ecosystem, often the ecosystem will fail because they're not doing that sort of transformation. So that's why actually that probably should have a nice, stars all around it to say without that, you may have a functioning system, but you're not likely to get the robust sort of dynamic system, adaptive system that we're thinking about.
Great. No questions? Yes, can you press your button to turn yours off?
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very abstract. I was wondering if you could give some examples of how this works in practice, and like maybe an example of how some of the data collected by scientists is actually used by policymakers, something along those lines.
Yeah, so on that diagram that I had with the, see if I can go back to that one, I think it's close enough. This middle layer, the infrastructures are fairly well developed, so you would sort of recognize any number of different repositories, data centers, and so on. They have data either download or increasingly data services, web map service, a web feature service, and so on. In the center level, it can be anything. The mediation could be as simple as I need a map in a polar stereographic projection rather than a UTM or transverse Mercator projection. And that's actually, it seems simple, but it's actually problematic if you're using some of the commercial map services because they don't actually provide polar stereographic. So one of our tools right now, we're having all kinds of difficulty getting a global scale satellite image in the proper projection. So that's where we're missing that key mediator because the big companies are saying it's not really of value to us to put it out there. It can be more advanced like an analytical. So a model is a mediation process. So if you're taking raw data, you're running a model with it, whether that be a global circulation model or some sort of ecological model, you're then producing some sort of new information out of those data that say, this particular data now, or the model tells us where the temperature is increasing or decreasing, or whether this is a favorable place for development or a less favorable place for resource development, and so on. Some of the ones that we're starting to see through the machine learning and the semantics that I talked about is where you develop what would be called an ontology, or a knowledge model that says, okay, in this community they're using these terms to describe particular phenomena, in this community they're using these terms, and here are the relationships. So instead of having a grad student, churn away for 6 months or a year and actually try and merge all of those together, you have these semantic mediation technologies that will say, okay, I'm pulling data from here, I'm pulling data from here, I'm using the knowledge models to say, here's where they meet, and I'm generating a new, shapefile, or a new sort of GIS layer, or a new table that is actually going to have the data from 4 different organizations. I don't know if normalized is the right term, but mediated such that they can actually be presented together on a community-agreed translation process. And that's pretty important, is that you don't want to have people who really don't know the field creating these models and saying, okay, this is how we're going to do the mediation. So those are some of the sort of the real-world examples that are actually functioning right now. And some of them are things we've been doing for many, many decades. But it's a matter of saying, well, how do we do it if we're thinking about doing this at a global scale, right from the local right up to the global? How is this going to work? Because often the mediation is still done in a sort of what I'll call maybe an ad hoc or a one-off kind of way, where you do have a small community, or even within your own lab, and you all kind of know how that mediation is happening, and you get your end product. But how do you scale that up to say, well, I can share that mediation process with my colleagues in another country, or with dozens of colleagues around the world? And the new systems that we're seeing increasingly support that type of thing from a systems level. So for example, now the Open Geospatial Consortium, which works more with geospatial data, they have what's called a WPS, or a web processing service. So instead of saying, I want this map, or I want this layer of data, you say, I want this result. And so here's what I want out of it. Here are the parameters to my request. And can you please run the model and then generate this result sort of in real or near real time? It may not happen instantaneously depending on the computation. So all of those things are sort of there, but there are so many of them that I don't tend to list all of the specifics.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question if anybody has. Okay, well, let me ask them one more question then about, you mentioned about information sovereignty, but how do you feel about information ownership? Is this something that needs to be wrestled with in these discussions, or is the idea being that the default that all information wants to be free?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and it's one that we're going to talk a lot about in the RCN, and it's actually being discussed, elsewhere as well, because there's a big movement towards open data, and at the same time there are these contexts, as I said, whether it be indigenous knowledge, or whether you're thinking about health data or other types of personally identifiable data, where those are not by nature open. The challenge is, establishing as a community, if you will, and as a society, what we consider to be appropriately open. In the IASC statement on data sharing that was released in 2013, we used the term, when we were drafting that, ethically open data, which says, yes, it should by default be open, but you have to consider the ethical dimensions to that. And that's not a new concept, because if you looked at the International Polar Year data policy, it said all data must be open. However, if you're thinking about things like indigenous knowledge, the rights of the knowledge holders must be respected. If you're thinking about sensitive areas, like, for example, a sensitive nesting site for an endangered species, that must be considered. And if you're thinking about things that are under research or IRB in the US, REB in Canada, so ethics, approvals, you also need to consider those types of things. So it's just a way of saying there are already a number of exceptions to open data, but we have to recognize, particularly in the Arctic, it's relevant to think about the indigenous perspectives on that, as well as some other situations.
Thank you. Well, why don't everybody join me in thanking Peter again. So thanks everybody for coming for this seminar today. Please do fill out the evaluation forms. These are really important so we know how to improve the program for the future. I want to announce a couple of upcoming events. The November 30th, we're going to be featuring Courtney Carruthers and Laura Zanotti, who are going to be talking about their work. And then on February 12th, Roberto Delgado and Andrea Marquez Horvath will be speaking about their work in the human health dimension. All of the recordings for all of the seminars are available online at our website, as is registration for the upcoming events. Again, one more time, I invite you all to become a member of ARCUS. We would love to have you be part of the Arctic research community, and invite you to join us when we get together for the annual meeting of ARCUS at the American Geophysical Union meeting in New Orleans this year in December. We also make available to the community a couple of meeting rooms that are available to anybody having an Arctic-related meeting. So feel free to let us know if you're interested in using that space for any meetings that you might be organizing related to the Arctic. And hope you can come to the upcoming seminars and to the meeting. And finally, hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for coming.